Hey everyone, my name is Justin Woodring, and this is Computing Science with Justin Woodring. Um, Today I wanted to talk about AI. It's kind of a catch-all phrase these days, but in particular, I wanted to talk about what it means to have an open source model. Um, this is a misused term, and really, what someone's saying these days when they say open source model is that they have open weights, which means you can download the model and run it yourself. What it doesn't mean is that the source is actually open. Um, and that's kind of a problem. So, really, I would kind of liken it to maybe almost like, let's say you had this really complex, you know, um, you had this really complex, like, 3D object of some kind. You can picture something, anything you want, maybe an elephant, like an elephant figurine or something like that. And you shine a light on it, and it casts a shadow, right? But when someone's saying they're giving you open weights, all you're really getting is just kind of like the shadow. Like they're still not giving you the source material here. Um, you know, and that really fundamentally again that's a problem. And why is that a problem? Well, because really it means that you don't have any insight into how a model specifically these modern foundational LLMs are actually trained. um especially with like considering recent model DeepSeek, right? So DeepSeek just came out of China and is wiping the floor with all the other models, per the usual with new models that get released that are, all hyped up. Um, but one interesting thing is that, and you can do your own research on this, but one interesting thing is that if you ask it anything about controversial subjects in China, um, it just won't answer them. It'll be like, oh, I can't talk about what happened at Tiananmen Square, right? Um, And naturally, this model was made in China and it's reviewed by China. So, um, it's not going to say anything defamatory about China, which, I exactly what China wants. But in even avoiding politics here, the problem is that even if this model is open weights, it's always going to basically have some kind of signature imbued into it by its creators, and specifically without the source material that um, was used to train it, we really have no insight into how a particular model was trained. So these models can exhibit things like Trojan kind of behavior, like intentionally misleading people about certain things, perhaps. Uh, with open weights, you're only getting access to the ability to effectively use the model on your own systems. And that's a pretty big deal in and of itself. But what open weights isn't is open source, right? Um, so if we go back to the origin of the word open source, it obviously has very little legal meaning. And this has been contested multiple times about what it actually means. At this point, there's no strict definition of what open source means. Typically, it refers to a collection of licenses um, that code originally was released under. Um, and those licenses do have strict legal meaning, um, but at least the good ones do. But open source itself is kind of a catch-all term. And so what really happened here is, these AI companies kind of just, open source became cool. Um, it's kind of like being eco-friendly, like it's kind of it's good like a tag you could slap on some like a car or something like that and be like, oh, it's open source, it's cool. But that's a problem. Again, because you really, if you're a manager trying to decide whether you want to incorporate an AI model into your project and you see it's open source, you're like, okay, it's going to be safe because it's open source. But open source doesn't mean safe, and even more so, open source doesn't actually even mean anything. Um, it's really strictly up to the person labeling something as open source to determine what open source means. Um, so let's say that, right, like maybe futuristically, somehow we end up, you know, imposing some kind of restriction on where these models come from in the United States, right? And so you're no longer allowed to use DeepSeek. Um, but you're like, okay, but I've got the open weights, so it should be fine, right? But the weights aren't really going to do anything for you because, um, I mean, you've got an old copy of a model, but you can't really update it, and you don't really know what it was trained on. And even more so, uh, without knowing what the model is trained on, you can't even be sure that a model that you're using today isn't using infringed or copyrighted material. So the worst case scenario is, and I'm not saying this is impossible, but just the worst case scenario really is that, um, you know, the government's already at least proposed and slash or decided that, you know, the absolute worst case they could do, or the worst case kind of technique they could employ to stop AI from progressing in an uh, illegal manner would be to basically just completely delete the AI model altogether, like everything associated with it, like no more, you know, no more OpenA1 ChatGPT or whatever, right? So, and again, the reason why is because how else are you supposed to prevent it from using copyrighted material if you don't know what it was trained on? We haven't seen this actually done yet, but the thing to consider here, importantly, is that just because a model is open weight doesn't mean that it is safe to use necessarily. And what I mean by this in particular is this kind of overall concept that if you don't know what it was trained on, you can't be sure that you're not using infringed or copyrighted material. Um, and depending on the future legislation, it could be possible that your entire software product that basically contingents upon having this particular model and the way that it works and the knowledge base it's trained on available, maybe you won't be able to use that model anymore. You know, maybe it would be considered aiding and abetting in this copyrighted infringement just because you're using a model that uses copyrighted materials illegally, right? So, again, this is all hypothetical. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that specifically, especially as a developer these days, or maybe a product owner or manager, these decisions, although it's very exciting to use AI in these LLMs, it's incredibly important to consider what licensing and where the data is actually coming from. And there's some companies that, you know, they actually publish the data sets they use. That's amazing. That's really what we want. That if you have access to the data set that was used to train the model, then you truly have an open source model because you have access to the source that was used to train the model. What's not open source is an open weight model. This is really much more akin to the more kind of classic freeware kind of style of code distribution. Um, and what comes with it is a lot of liability in the sense that, again, you could be using something that is intentionally trying to damage your infrastructure or mislead your customers, or you know, you don't really know what a model is trained to do, and it could be trained only to do this for one particular task. You could have a perfectly good, you could have, you know, it honestly it could be any of these models. They're huge. They could be trained on one particular thing to completely mislead people, and without knowing the actual source material that these things were trained on, you can't know this behavior. So this is more or less kind of not to say again, you can't be excited about AI, or that you shouldn't, you know, think follow AI, or that you shouldn't understand AI, or you shouldn't go learn AI, because all of this stuff I'm not saying you shouldn't do. What I'm saying is ultimately you should be careful when advocating for the use of, especially in a software product or integrated into a company environment, advocating for the use of an AI, specifically an LLM, that is trained and open weight, called open source, but you really have no information about what it was trained on or how it was trained or anything like that. Um, and again, I think this is kind of more like one of those kind of hypothetical rants. You know, doesn't necessarily mean anything bad will happen, but it's important to consider these things. So I'm putting this out there, and I mean, I hope this kind of starts, you know, at least for people who, maybe didn't know to consider this, I hope this kind of helps. Maybe maybe helps you pick a better model, honestly. But yeah, putting this out there, like I said, definitely I would not say get too excited about any particular model until you really know what there is to know about the model. Again, DeepSeek might be outperforming ChatGPT on certain things like, coding and stuff like that. But it's not really great if you can't rely on it for other things like, providing a factual summary of Tiananmen Square. Or at least you should know the strengths and weaknesses of each particular model. So again, this is more or less kind of laying the framework for a little bit more consideration in how you should approach this overall hype-filled world of LLMs and AI. If you like this, definitely leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Until next time.